I'd like to welcome you to a new symposium series, which is called The Food and Nutrition Policy for the 21st Century. Many of you, I'm looking around, have been with us through a previous seminar series that we had funded by the Gates Foundation on global food security and food policy, and that was a huge success. All the materials are online, freely available, and also there is a book from that you can order for those of you who are interested in actually having the papers that were written. But this seminar series and symposium series, which will start today and run, I think, for the next couple of years, is funded by different friends, Zachary Nelson and Elizabeth Horn, who have been long-term friends of the Center on Food Security and the Environment, and especially long-term friends of Wally and Laura Falcon. They were very close to the Falcon family when actually Zach was here at Stanford as an undergrad, and they've named the series after Wally and Laura's son, Philip, who passed away a few years ago. And so we were hoping that Zach and Elizabeth would be here. They may be coming in late, but I really wanted to thank them for their generosity for this new series. So tonight we have, or this afternoon, we have Tom Hertel and Joe Swinnen talking. Their bios and a little bit of their background is in the pamphlet that's on your chair. The problem with getting two very famous people in this field is I could do a 2-hour introduction, but that would really take away from their time, so I'm going to keep my comments very short. Both Tom Hertel and Joe Swinnen are extremely well known in this field of global food security, food policy, and food pricing. And so we're really lucky to have them here. Many of you might have met them. They were both visiting scholars at the center in earlier periods and still continue to be visiting fellows at the Center for Food Security and the Environment. The only real difference since you last saw them here at Stanford was they've both gained some extra awards and I would say notorieties also on their CVs. For Tom, really a very major honor. He was chosen among all of Purdue's entire faculty to receive the university's inaugural Research and Distinguished Scholarship Award recently. It's a real honor. And on notoriety, Joe has been named the president of the Beer Economics Society. And I am a beer drinker, so this is true to my heart. And I should say, he is missing a major beer fest in Europe right now. So we're especially honored to have Joe and also to have Tom here. What they're going to talk about today, as you know, is the topic, has the food price bubble burst? And so from this title, you can tell there has been a food price bubble, and the speakers tonight will tell us whether they think it's burst or not. Tom is going to start, and he's going to give us more of a long-run perspective on food price bubbles and spikes. And Joe will give us an assessment or whether or not it matters whether this food price bubble actually does burst. So each of them will speak for about 35 minutes, and please hold your questions. And we hope to have a really dynamic conversation afterwards. And I just will note that this whole seminar series will be taped today. We're doing something new with this series. Each of them have given a 10-minute TED Talk on their topics, which will also be online later this week. So without further ado, I'll welcome Tom to the podium. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here today talking about bursting the bubble. In fact, that's my job. Johan and I have a division of labor. My job is to burst the bubble, and his job is to talk about why that really doesn't matter. But I'm taking a long-run perspective here, which is more my cup of tea. And I want to say, first of all, that this is joint work with Joris Baldus, a PhD student at Purdue University. It's great to be back here at the Center for Food Security and the Environment. I was here 2 years ago on sabbatical and had a great time. One of my favorite things was to come to these symposia that Roz and with able assistance from Wally have organized, and they're always a great time, very stimulating, good speakers, nice reception afterwards. I assume we can count on that, and a lot of good discussion. So without further ado, let me launch into this talk and talk about this. We're talking about a possible bubble. There must be a run-up in prices, and we've seen that Here I've shown corn prices, but you could show a lot of commodities and a lot of foodstuffs, for which the prices have risen sharply since 2005. This led the World Bank, for example, to suggest that high and volatile food prices have become the new normal. FAO noted that long-term trend in declining food prices has been reversed. And OECD and FAO jointly, similarly concluded that we're in a new era. So the problem is prices have now recently dropped, corn prices in particular. Is this just a temporary setback to this new normal, or is this a reversal? Have we burst the bubble? This is the question at hand. So I want to talk about this. I want to talk about it in a long-term perspective. So I'm going to go back to kind of fundamentals. Economists like to think about demand and supply, and we'll stay true to that tradition. On the demand side, talking about population, income, biofuels. And on the supply side, talking about things like yield gaps, climate change, research and development, and so on. And I'll touch on some other issues as well that I think are pertinent to the question. So I'm going to do this by looking through a lens. I like to think about global economic analysis in terms of models. And here we're using what we call the simple model, a simplified model of international prices, land use, and the environment. And it's proven particularly useful for thinking about crop prices over the long run. So if you want to look forward 45 years, I would argue the first thing you need to do is look backwards 45 years. Because if you can't understand what's happened in the past and perhaps explain that, how can you have any hope of understanding the future? So that's where we start, with a historical perspective. Now, what's special about 1961 to 2006, our historical period, is that there was a remarkable increase in crop production over that period, a tripling of production, and yet crop prices over that period fell. So there was strong demand growth, but also strong action on the supply side. So we want to think about that and think about that in terms of the future. Now, in terms of explaining this figure, red means population. So because I put on this pair of supercharged glasses, I can actually see within this price what's been driving it up and what's been driving it down. So the red is the population pressure pushing upward on prices. The orange is their income pressure pushing up on prices, and the green is the technology supply side pushing down on prices. So looking forward to the future, if the first thing, maybe the most sensible thing might be to start out by saying, let's do a naive forecast. Let's assume that all of the same drivers were the same going out into the future. Population, income, technology, regional composition was the same. And if we projected that forward for 45 years, you get the same result, not surprisingly. That's what a model does for you. It generates consistency in analysis. The bars are a little different because the economy is bigger going forward, but basically the story is the same. So that's a great way to start, because we know that things are going to be different going into the future. Let's start taking those apart one by one. Let's start with population. We know that population growth is actually slowing. While we expect population to continue to grow out to 2100, the growth rate is slowing, and that's very important when you're talking about a foot race between supply and demand. Because every year, the number of people we're adding, or in this case, every decade, this shows decadal increments to population, those are falling. So population's rising, but the decadal increments to global population are falling. This means in this foot race, you don't have to run quite as fast to keep up with these population increments. The other interesting thing that's going on in terms of population and important for global food demand is that the composition of population growth is slowing. Over that historical period, we still had reasonably rapid population growth in many of the rich countries. And adding a person in California or Germany or Belgium, the beer drinkers in Belgium, puts more pressure on the global food system. They have more purchasing power. But in the future, we're going to be adding, most people are going to be added in Africa and South Asia, regions with much lower purchasing power per capita. So that even though population growth is continuing to grow, the weight of those additional people will be less than it has been historically. For both of those reasons, when we redo this a naive forecast and put in population projections rather than historical population, look at how much that red bar shrinks. Look at how the driver of demand, what's been historically the most important driver of demand for food, is shrinking. So that's population. I've left the orange bar, or the income and technology pictures the same so far. Let's talk about income, the orange bar. Let's work on that a little bit. Income growth is very important also for food demand. So if the population in Africa experiences an income increase, as they have over the last decade, record growth in many parts of Africa in terms of per capita GDP growth, you see a transformation of food consumption. So of course people consume more. That's the horizontal axis getting wider as we move up the living standards ladder. But the composition of what they consume changes. More livestock products, more sugars and edible oils. Generally, these products put a lot more pressure on the global food system. So from an income point of view, it's a very different story. It's actually the low-income countries, when they experience income growth, that we experience from the income side the most pressure on demand. So we have an interesting separation here between population and income. This shows you within the simple framework, breaks down the sources of increased demand for crops. You could eat the crops directly. You can feed them to livestock. That's the yellow here. Or you can put them through the processed food channels and eat them in the form of breakfast cereal or spaghetti or something else. And you can see most of the incremental growth across the board is in these processed products. So that's where the growth is likely to be, the increased demand for crops. So when we put these pictures together, the orange component actually rises. So here we've got kind of conflicting forces at work. On the one hand, population becoming less important as a driver, income becoming more important as a driver. In fact, I would say for the first time in history, income will surpass population as a driver of global food demand, and that's a remarkable feat. It's always been the fact of adding more people that's really driven food demand. Now income plays a very important role. Now up to now, I have left the green bar constant. We'll revisit that in a moment. Before we do so, we need to talk about some other demand drivers. Historically, in that historical period, biofuels wasn't so critical, but in the last 10 years, it's become very important. And what's the major driver of that? Well, energy prices, subsidies, and mandates. So let me talk a little about biofuels. Over a period from 2005 to 2007, half of the global increase, again, we're talking about increments here, half of the global increase in cereals demand worldwide, half of that increase came from ethanol demand in the Midwest of the United States. It's amazing how much this was boosting global demand. And you can see it in this very steep ramping up over that period from, as I said, 2005 out to 2007, 2008, 2009. The percent, reading off this right axis, the percent of corn going to ethanol just skyrocketed. This really helped contribute to those price increases. But look at USDA's forecast out beyond the current period. The blue bar is a very modest increase in the total billion bushels going to ethanol, and actually a decline in the percent of corn going to ethanol. And if part of the factor behind that is that subsidies and mandates are being rolled back in the US and EU. These are being challenged actively. And is this a good thing for the country? Is this a good thing for society? And as a result, there's a lot of pressure on these policies. Add to that the fact that oil prices have now flattened off to a great degree. We're not seeing such strong increases. And that's leading to this kind of modest biofuels growth projections as we see in the US. Now, of course, this could all change. If oil prices took off again, that could drive a big increase in biofuels. Second-generation biofuels are waiting in the wings to come in if oil prices rise significantly, and this could change pressure on the world's land resources and hence on food prices. So a bit of uncertainty there. At this point, I'm simply going to go with the International Energy Agency's current policy scenario, and you can see in that case, it's a modest increment to prices. So we've been working on the top side of this, the demand side. Now let's go to the supply side, the green. And here we'll start with just a review of this historical record, which is really quite remarkable. As I said, a tripling of crop production over this period, and most of it coming from increased yields and cropping intensity. Very little from area expansion. That's a fantastic record, and very much contributed to this declining price over that period. So can this be maintained in the future? Well, a number of notable researchers, including former speakers here at this podium, have argued that there's been a slowing of yield growth. We need to reconsider this, possibly looking into the future. So this is what's going to happen to that green bar needs some careful thought. Is this, and there could be a variety of factors driving that, as we'll talk about now. So one thing people think about a lot are yield gaps. And this is the gap between what people currently achieve in terms of yields, say in southern Africa, and what the maximum potential yield is for that agroecological environment. And this map shows yield gaps for maize around the world, calculated in a very simple way, comparing each region to the region producing at the highest yield for that biophysical environment. And you can see in Africa, yields are very, very low. So these authors, taking a strictly biophysical point of approach, suggested that if you close these yield gaps, you could increase maize production by 50%. Well, in that case, we're done. Maybe we've solved the problem. However, those who've thought deeply about yield gaps, such as Bob Hurt, writing back in the late 70s in the wake of the first phase of the Green Revolution, made a very important observation, namely what's technically possible is often more modest than what most observers admit. And the economics of substantially higher yields is often not attractive. So, excuse me. And what he means is that in those places in Africa, showing up very red in the map, very low yields, they're isolated from world markets. If they produce more, where are they going to sell it? They're facing really low prices for their products. They want to apply more fertilizer to boost their yields. They've got to bring that in from the port. The costs are very expensive for getting it there. So your input costs are high, your output prices are low. Yeah, the economics is not attractive. So rectifying that is a bigger job than simply doing some more science in the lab. It's all the aspects of improving infrastructure, institutions, and other aspects of the economy are relevant for that. Another aspect of the productivity debate and future yields is climate change and climate impacts. And I definitely wanted to get in a couple of slides on this because the IPCC Working Group 2 report involved a number of professors from Stanford playing an important role in that analysis of impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability with respect to climate change. And here are a few relevant quotes. For example, the negative impacts on average yields globally become likely in the 2030s, and suggesting that from there on out, a drag on yield growth on a decadal basis in the range up to 2%. So that's out to, I've drawn a line here at 2050 because that's kind of where I'm stopping my analysis, but look at what happens after 2050. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but it's looking more and more pessimistic. The higher temperatures, greater yield penalty. And I want to make the point that in my analysis, I'm really cutting it off here. So obviously many factors will come into play after 2050, the population aspects I'm not developing here and other things. But I'm going to make the argument that if you just look out to 2050, the aggregate effects are going to be modest relative to a lot of the other things I'm talking about. So I think very important for what's technically possible in the coming decades is the research and development expenditure that's being invested in agriculture. And here I want to draw your attention to the response of the research and development community and the foreign assistance community, as well as the private sector, to the recent price spike. And we're going to hear more about this from Swinnen, including perhaps why this is the case, explaining a rationale for this. I just want to make the point that there have been very strong increases since 2000 in R&D for agriculture, both in the public and the private sector. China, India, and Brazil are leading the way. And as a result, if sustained, this could generate substantial payoffs in the coming decades in terms of productivity growth. So that's on the optimistic side. Overall, we've taken projections that I won't go into the details now, but our projection for the future is more modest than the past, but still shows a price decline. This is what it looks like in terms of a long-run perspective. Pretty much a continuation of historical declines, but a continuation for different reasons. As I said, the drivers are different. So we expect, in contrast to the World Bank and the FAO, a resumption of the downward trend in long-run crop prices. But depending on what happens to technology, things could go up or could go down. So back with the economists' typical problem of saying on the one hand, on the other hand, and I want to kind of confront that uncertainty in the following way. Let's just formalize this analysis by a Monte Carlo simulation. So we'll do 1,000 simulations of this model. And we'll say, well, population growth could be slow, it could be high. Income growth could be high. And we don't really fully know. I've incorporated uncertainty in terms of the economic response to those, what we call the income elasticity of demand. That's also uncertain, as is the price response on the supply and demand side. So all these factors are uncertain. So let's take the approach of just sampling from these distributions, solving the model many, many times, and asking what does that resulting distribution look like. And the striking thing here is that, of course, we get some significant price increases. If you draw a high population growth rate, high income growth, slow technological progress, you can get a significant price increase over this future. And so maybe these international institutions are right, but they're in the tail of the distribution. And they need to recognize that. They aren't. 80% of these outcomes are in favor of a resumption of the price declines. So I think it's a nice way to think about this uncertainty, recognizing that everyone may be right, but the likelihood of their being right may vary. I want to talk about a few emerging issues that aren't factored into some of that formal analysis, but are important, and I'll give you my opinion about them. Urbanization is the first. Here's a map of urbanization over the last 50 years, and you can see since 1950 there has been a great increase in these mega cities, the big red circles being more than 5 million people in an urban area, especially in South Asia and China. How will that evolve over the next 50 years? Well, here are those forecasts out the next 50 years, and most of this population growth, and a lot of will be in the developing countries, and most of it will be in the cities. So you can see what a mess in China and South Asia, a lot of urbanization. Isn't that going to reshape this picture? Don't you want to rethink your idea about bursting the bubble in light of this urbanization? So we're going to factor that into the analysis in a moment. Another thing that gets a lot of attention is water scarcity. And water scarcity, here we've undertaken an analysis starting in the year 2000 and going out. This is in conjunction with the group at IFPRI that do a lot of work on water. And they calculate the irrigation water scarcity index. And you can see that scarcity increases significantly again in South Asia and China and those regions. The pressure of urbanization, the pressure of water scarcity, seems like these are big markets. A lot of world's production occurs here. This could make a big difference. Well, let's first of all look, before we look at world prices, let's look at trade and how that's influenced. The region that's most scarce in this analysis is the rest of South Asia, in particular Pakistan, for varied reasons. And this shows where Pakistan might increase its imports from in light of this water scarcity. So I'm not projecting everything here. I'm just showing change relative to some baseline due to the water scarcity. And you can see increased imports of food will be a consequence of that water scarcity. Similarly for India, China, and this shows the whole picture. So yeah, a lot of action from this water scarcity, potentially also from urbanization. How does this add up? Well, we put it in the simple model. This is kind of our adding machine here, which takes into account the fact that food is grown around the world. Food is traded around the world. And you can see the price impacts are very modest. Why is that? Because it's a localized phenomenon. Both the urbanization and the water scarcity are localized phenomena. When land is converted to agriculture near the cities, often you see expansion elsewhere in the rural areas or in other parts of the world. That increased trade was coming from somewhere due to the water scarcity. They were expanding to meet that demand. So factoring these in, I would argue that those are likely to have a modest effect on the global price picture, but very significant local impacts, particularly as we saw in Asia. Another source of potential food supply for consumption that's gotten a lot of additional attention is food waste and food post-harvest losses. So the FAO has estimated that 1/3 of global production is lost or wasted. Can't we just convert that to additional supply for consumers? It's a question a lot of people are asking. So if you look at the profile of those losses, of course, most of the food waste is in the rich countries. Post-harvest losses dominate in sub-Saharan Africa. There's no food waste in sub-Saharan Africa. Very little food gets wasted there for obvious reasons, but a lot of post-harvest losses. So we've actually done the calculation in simple, although I haven't incorporated it here. It was a student doing it in a course last semester that crop prices would drop by 1/3 if we could eliminate with one sweep of the wand all of these post-harvest losses. But in fact, that requires significant investment, and there are a lot of reasons why that food waste occurs, including very scarce times for many people. A single parent trying to manage a household doesn't have the time, perhaps, to conserve that. So there are reasons for food waste and post-harvest losses, and attacking that obviously could increase global supplies, but we're not going to eliminate those losses overnight. Another very important factor that we need to bear in mind is the competition in the long run between food, fuel, and environmental services from land, and the reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. RED is an important initiative, a very young initiative, but an important one designed to provide additional environmental services, in particular forest carbon sequestration, from the land base. And it's something we've studied recently, a publication in PNAS, where we studied the impacts of RED Plus implementation worldwide in conjunction with Annex 1 emissions taxes on fossil fuels. So we face higher, here in California, face higher prices for our gasoline. In the developing world, it's all through the forest carbon incentives, either to prevent the kind of deforestation we're seeing here in the Amazon, or to encourage afforestation in parts of the world, reforestation. So what are those impacts? Well, we studied that in the context of global land use change and found that over a 20-year time frame, that kind of a policy maintained for 20 years would have a big impact on future forest land cover. And as a result, because forests, ultimately, there's a limited amount of land, and if you can't convert any more of that forest land for use in agriculture, you may limit the amount of cropland, and this is the resulting change in crop cover. So these are connected. What you do to preserve the environment through a RED program is connected to the food economy and to food prices ultimately, and could have a significant impact. So at this point, I was instructed to eye Wally carefully and see whether I'm over time. I think I'm okay still. So I'm going to add this all up. And I want to recall something, a quote I'm going to reveal in a moment who said this and when they said it. But let me just summarize this. Pessimism has arisen about the ability of the earth to feed its people. This is what's been dubbed the scarcity syndrome. Burgeoning population growth, doubts about the adequacy of the resource base, misgivings about weather in the years ahead. This sounds very contemporary. It's very much what's being talked about now. It was written in 1981. It was the last chapter in a USDA report, Will There Be Enough Food? And it was written by a Purdue colleague, Don Parlberg, who said, enough food? Sure, if we don't play it dumb. So you can see where he's coming out. He thinks that this writing in the wake of the food scare of the 70s, and that he was anticipating a positive response, and indeed that was realized. He really wrote this before one saw this play out, but you can see that continuing downward trend as the food system responded to those high prices. What we've seen in the last 7 years, and actually if we believe the futures markets out to 2016, which futures markets are essentially saying it's going to look the same as it looks now, so I'm not sure how much intelligent information there is there, but essentially the expectation is that we may continue more or less on trend as opposed to returning to this high price regime. So I would argue that what we're seeing, for different reasons, but in many ways, is similar to the food scare of the 70s. It's more modest, but the food system will be responding to this, and that global crop prices will likely resume their historical pattern of decline. Now, lower prices don't mean lower returns. Corn farmers in the Midwest, in this case, looking at revenue per acre plus insurance, there's been a strong, even as these crop prices have been declining, revenue has been rising. Why? Because improved technology lets them produce more with the same inputs. So even as prices are rising, revenue is continuing to rise. Now you can see, thinking about bubbles, thinking about a bubble maybe in the land market in the Corn Belt, this suggests that people who bought corn land in the Midwest expecting $1,000 per acre net return may be disappointed in the future. They may have overpaid for that land. So all of this leads me to conclude that recent price rise was likely a bubble. Now, just to wrap up a few of the main points behind this, it's not like the future is going to look like the past because the drivers are the same. The drivers are quite different, and the future trend isn't exactly the same. The reasons are certainly different. The composition is very different. We're going to see income as the major driver in the future as opposed to population. That's a radical change compared to world history. Energy prices still could alter this situation dramatically if we saw the high prices that are at the high end of that forecast from Department of Energy. Technological progress is clearly key for food prices and food security. We need to think carefully about that. An important point is water scarcity and urbanization. They get a lot of discussion. I started teaching a course in this area at Stanford and continued at Purdue. This comes up constantly. People are thinking about this. They see the water scarcity, this drought in California, the urbanization around San Francisco, Los Angeles, New Delhi, Shanghai, Beijing, and so on. You think, isn't that going to have an impact? It will have a big impact locally, regionally, and it will reshape the pattern of trade. But I don't think it will significantly alter the world price trajectory. Food waste and losses are another important source of supply, and there's some real interesting innovations in Africa. The PICS project, funded by the Gates Foundation, has generated interesting ways and affordable ways of reducing post-harvest losses, and that's effectively the same as producing more if you can get more to the consumer. And the climate mitigation policies, we need to keep our eye on that in the future, because it could play an important role if and when we get serious about climate mitigation, because land-based mitigation of the sort that has this impact on land use and food prices turns out to be one of the most economical ways to limit future greenhouse gas emissions. The reduced deforestation, but also reduced emissions from agriculture. All of this potentially puts supply-side pressure on the food system. So I'll wrap up there. There are some references when you put this on the web if you want to read in great detail about this. Thank you.
So it's great to share the podium with Tom. Tom and I actually share the same, we have the same PhD a long time ago. I mean, it feels a long time for me, so it must feel a long time for him. And it's because he's been always so encouraging for my research. Usually when I share the podium, I always give the provocative talk, okay? I'm not sure whether that's true today. I mean, at least I share some of the provocation, I think, with him. This presentation should be easy. I just gave it in 10 minutes, okay? So usually I always get in trouble with timing, but now if I can do it in 10 minutes, I should be able to do it in 30 minutes. So the title is, If the Food Price Bubble Burst, Would It Matter? So I'm not going to comment on Tom's presentation in the sense that whether he is right or wrong, or the extent to which. I'm just going to ask if he is right, does it matter? Okay? And so I'm going to focus, it's called the political economy perspective. I'm going to start off with some economic effects, looking mostly on the impact on poverty and food security, and then I'm going to look more on the political economy, the political dimension, and the policy making. So this is the slide I have on the left-hand side is a familiar picture now of the food price evolution over the past 15 years or so. And on the right-hand side is the evolution of poverty and undernourishment. Now, I left on purpose the years off, okay? So if you look at the left-hand side, you can, I think you know where 2007 is, okay? So the question to you is, where is 2007 on the right-hand side, okay? Now, you may say, why is he asking that? Well, if you read all the reports which have been written over the past 5 years, you should be able to identify where 2007 and 2008 are. Because everybody was arguing, or many reports, that the spike in food prices and the higher food prices since then were going to have a major impact on poverty and on undernourishment, okay? And it's not particularly clear where that would happen, right? So here's the years, okay, and that's where it is. So now, why hasn't this had this spike in food price? Didn't it have this major increase or significant increase in poverty or in malnourishment? Well, one of the reasons is that a lot of these studies which have been done were simulation studies, and of course it's a ceteris paribus analysis, and not everything is ceteris paribus. So particularly the studies that are now coming out and which take an ex-post perspective and look at what's actually being observed, they show that across the globe, if you add up everything, food security has been remaining roughly the same, and if anything, it has improved rather than worsened over this period. Okay, so probably the most important factor there is there's two main factors. One is the strong economic growth in the largest countries. I mean, largest in the sense also where most of the poor people live, which is India and China. So that's a very important element. However, given this global perspective, this aggregate perspective, if you look in more detail in specific countries, specific regions, and within countries, okay, you see this large heterogeneity. And so some countries, some households have lost out significantly, and there are certainly places where food security has not improved, but has gotten significantly worse. And so you can think about rural versus urban households, where rural households, where people are typically selling food and benefiting from higher prices, and urban households who are hurt by the higher food price because it increases their cost of living. Same thing at the national level, at the country level. So you have countries exporting food versus importing food, and of course these price effects matter differently there. And some countries have growing fast and others have not grown fast or not at all. And so this is some data from sub-Saharan Africa, where we have looked at basically evolutions of self-reported food security, and essentially what you see there, it's if you look at the aggregates effect, the red line is if you would have no effect in terms of the food security over this from 2005 to 2008. So the countries above the line have gotten worse, and the ones below have gotten better, and you see that there's a correlation between the net food importing situation and the economic growth effect, like our economic models would predict, and that's also on aggregate what we find out. But obviously there's countries with some outliers because other things played a role as well. Okay. So if you look a bit longer, because a lot of the effects that we just measured are really up till 2008. That's really what the spike happened the first time. Okay. And what happens the year itself? Well, from the production side, it's very hard to adjust, because if you want to expand your crop output, I mean, you need to basically expand. You need to use more land or more fertilizer or whatever. So it takes some time to adjust. So if you look at it over a couple of years, this is what medium run means here. When you look to 2011, 2012, etc., then the new studies show, particularly a very nice study by Derek Heddy, he shows that at the global level, again, food price increase has accelerated the rate of global poverty reduction. That's what he argues. And why is that? The reason is essentially that most of the poor people, or the majority of poor people, depend on agriculture as a source of income. And so if increasing prices for agricultural products are essentially improving the income of more people than they're actually hurting other poor people. Okay, so it's roughly a 75% versus 25% effect. And so one is the smallholder farms, and therefore you have a direct effect on their income, in a sense, basically on their revenue because prices go up. But also the landless rural benefit because of this wage effect that if you have the prices going up, basically the people who produce the land and they hire the labor, that leads to an increase in their wages, and that also benefits the landless rural, who are typically the poorest people of all. And this is also coming from a recent study by Hanan Jacobi from the World Bank, and essentially he's looking in rural India, which is probably where the most poor people in the world live, in rural India, and he's done a study there, and he actually shows that the wages have quite elastically responded. I mean, they've gone up with the food prices, and this is benefiting not just the net food-producing households, but even the households which are net food consumers in rural areas, because the wage effects are stronger than the price effects. Okay, and that, of course, in terms of how you look at these food prices, I mean, that's very important to understand. So, if the food price bubble would burst, would it matter? If I'm answering the first part of the question, if I look at the economic effects, the first thing to say that we're going to have heterogeneous effects, just like as we had heterogeneous effects when the prices went up. Okay, it will be the opposite effect, obviously, and there would be heterogeneous among countries, food importers versus food exporters, and among households, obviously. Whether, if we look at the aggregate effect, it depends on when it would happen, what the economic growth would be at that particular point. And of course, it may be, if you look at what Tom predicted on the urbanization, if most of the poor in the future will live in the urban areas versus where they are living in the rural areas right now, that of course would affect the net effect or the aggregate effect. Okay? And then the third element that we should think about is the nature of the price changes. And that I mean, if it would be a gradual evolution, it allows people to adjust, it allows the producers to adjust, but also the consumers. Obviously, when we have a shock effect again, as we had in 2007, 2008, that's very different because you have the volatility effect influences all this. Okay, I don't think what I've said here is all that new, if you want. I'm just pulling together a whole bunch of new research that came out. Let's then look at the political effects, okay? And so what I mean political means, of course, all kinds of things. So it could mean stability of governments or whatever. Or basically international relations. What I'm going to look at is a more narrow aspect. I'm going to look at how policies are chosen, both at the national governments, but in particular by the global development community. Okay. And how these food prices have influenced that. So, let's go back a bit. Consider we are in the mid-2000s, so roughly 10 years ago. So what do we know? Well, we know that what was the case then? Rural poverty and hunger were very severe. I mean, prices had been low for many decades. Basically, the European Union, for example, had been subsidizing its farmers, had been driving down long-run food prices or agricultural prices, which were hurting farmers. And so there was a lot of poverty and malnutrition, as the figure I just showed documented. But if you look at the policy agenda, and also I'm going to bring in the mass media here because I think it'll show it's an important factor, it's fairly low, remarkably low on policymakers' priority agendas. It's really receiving, agriculture, for example, receiving less donor funding, increasingly less donor funding. So these are data, this picture here is, if you look at all the development aid which has been given in the world, if you look at the share which is going to agriculture, then you see this goes from 96 till 2000. You see this is declining dramatically. It goes from more than 10% to less than 4%. So it's a huge decline in the decade preceding 2007. And if you look at mass media, I mean, there's the occasional report on poverty and farmers' problems, but nothing substantial really. Okay? Now, let's fast forward a few years. Something happened with my format here, but many things are happening. Okay, so we have a new president which is being elected. We have the Arab Revolution taking place, and my co-authors thought what was most important was that Italy won the World Cup soccer during this period. What happened with, that's where the formatting changed. In any case, so what happened with poverty and malnutrition? Essentially, poverty decreased from 27% to 20% over this period of time of roughly 7 years. And basically, undernourishment, according to the FAO data, declined from 14% till 12%. And so depending on the study or the numbers that you get, somewhere between 50 and 200 million people moved out of poverty or food insecurity, okay? And again, roughly, it's still the rural people which are suffering more, okay? So things are much better. Now, what do we see these days? So I said already, poverty and hunger are globally lower than they were a decade ago or so. But what we see is that agricultural problems, rural poverty, food security are all over the mass media. Okay, I can show you many reports, and I'll document it in a second. It's very high on the policymakers' priority agenda, and they're receiving much more donor funding. And to illustrate that, I've put the same picture I just had now, but I have extended it from 2007 till 2011 or 2012, and you see there's clearly a turnaround, okay? So the percentage going to agriculture of all development aid has increased from less than 4% to roughly 7% now, almost a doubling over 5 years' time, okay? So that's an amazing turnaround. I've also put a picture here from Commission President Barroso, who I hear is going to speak at Stanford tomorrow, actually, and he shakes hands with the Director General of FAO, and so both of them are going to join to fight hunger. This is from 2012. So the issue is not so much why are they want to fight hunger in 2012, why didn't we get this picture 10 years earlier? That's the question really what I'm interested, okay? The problems were worse a decade earlier, so why do we have this big turnaround in policy, priorities, donor funding, etc., compared to a decade ago? What I'm going to argue here is that we have something, what I would call a perfect storm in the political economy of global food policy. And I'm going to point out 3 sub-effects which kind of come together over the past decade through food price spikes, essentially, okay? So it's a relative income effect, it's a political organization cost effect, and a media effect. And I'm going to explain now what I mean by these. So the relative income effect is essentially that what we've seen, and observed it in many different cases in history, is that what happens is when times are good for farmers or times are good for food consumers, depending on prices going up or prices go down, they're happy, okay? The moment things turn around, for example, when prices start going down for the farmers or prices go up for the food consumers, essentially what people do is basically they shift from relying on the market to trying to rely on government. So they start lobbying government to basically shift things around so that they are protected against the market effect, okay? So it's a fairly simple argument, and this is what we've seen over time. And this would, of course, predict that we will see a pressure shift from the producer side going through the consumer side. The second argument is, and the reason why that matters in the overall picture, okay, is because generally consumers are easier to organize than farmers are to organize in developing country. And this goes back to Manker Olsen's famous book of 1965, The Logic of Collective Action, in which he essentially argues, basically the farmers are dispersed in the rural areas, it's hard to get them together for effective collective action. It's much easier to get the consumers who are in the cities, they can go on the street, start banging on the doors of the parliament, etc., for them to get together. And also the visibility is much higher because the media is out there next to the government offices, etc. And so that together makes that you have a much more effective pressure from urban groups, typically than from rural groups. And this is this has been often referred to as the urban bias in agricultural policy, okay? When I come back to this urban bias thing at the very end, arguing that there is a new type of urban bias, which we have seen over the past 5 years. The third factor is, and this is particularly important because of what I'm going to call the global development effect, is that mass media have become much more important over the past decade or 15 years or so, okay? So what we see, the first effect is that what really drives media attention are shocks, okay? If you have a gradual change, the increase in media attention that we'll get is very different than when this media attention, when this change occurs in a dramatic fashion, in a shock fashion. So media attention is typically event-driven or shock-driven, if you want. And the second thing is that there's numerous studies which show that if there is sufficient media coverage, that this drives political action and policymakers to act, okay? And that the absence of media coverage basically allows policymakers not to act, or basically doesn't attract their attention, and so not much is happening. And so this effect has been described in foreign policy making, in international aid, and all kinds of factors, all right? And so the thing is that the perfect storm hypothesis essentially says these three things come together. So we have the effect of increasing food prices, which changes the lobby pressures, okay, because it shifts the pressure on governments from producers to consumers, and they are better organized, more effective. And that effect is reinforced by the volatility of the shock and by this media effect, which comes in then and kind of reinforces this voice, not just at the national level, but at the global level, okay? So this leads me to four basically hypotheses of effect. First is that you would see a shift in focus or the pressure from producers to consumers. That's probably the least controversial hypothesis. The second one is that there will be an significant increase in media attention because of the shock. There'll be a shift in policy agendas, and there'll be a shift in budgets being allocated, the action that governments take, okay? And so what I'm going to go now, I'm going to basically look at the empirical evidence for each of these four factors. The first one is something I have basically been working on a bit earlier, so I'm just repeating this thing. You see a very clear shift in basically the pressure which is being on and the focus of groups which are active in this field. So this is two quotes from Oxfam, one in 2005 and one in 2008. And essentially, Oxfam in 2005 says that the big problem for food security in the world is that food prices, agriculture prices are low, okay? So 3 years later, in 2008, Oxfam is arguing that it's high food prices which are really the problem for food security in the world, because a lot of the consumers are being hurt. And in both cases, roughly 900 million people are affected, according to Oxfam. This is two quotes from FAO, and it's essentially the same thing, okay? So the long-term downward trend in agricultural prices threatens the food security of hundreds of millions of people in 2005. 3 years later, when prices have spiked, FAO is arguing that the rising food prices are worsening the already unacceptable level of deprivation suffered by almost 900 million people, okay? So that's the first point. There's a clear shift in basically what people think is causing food insecurity, and the thing we should be worrying about from the development organizations, etc. Then, the second point is the shift in the mass media coverage, right? And so how did we, here this is a very recent work we've done, how did we analyze that? We literally looked around the world for this thing, and the best data are in the US. So we found this data, this archive of US news resources. It's about 4,500 media sources, TV, radio, newspapers, etc. And so it has daily observations between 2000 and 2012, which is actually a nice period for us because the price shock is right in the middle there. And so the special software which searches this archive for basically the type of words which then capture how much attention media have paid to that now. Of course, this word selection is really crucial. So the way we did it was that we basically picked reports from organizations which are really active in this field, like Oxfam, like, for example, Greenpeace, like the World Bank, whatever, all kinds of organizations, academic outlets. And we basically said, but we put them both before and after the food price crash, okay? And we said, what's the keywords which are being used by these organizations, both before and after? And based on that, we did a number of different combination of words. This should not be price combination, it should be word combination, actually, okay? And so we did robustness test, right? And so the results are very robust. So this is what we find, okay? So we see that here on this picture, where is the pointer? Ah, here, great. So the red line here, that's the food price, okay? So what I showed earlier, I mean the big fluctuations, so this is 2007 here, okay, this is where the spikes occur, the first one, second one, and high here. And the blue line, that's media coverage, okay? And you see, and here's the correlation between the both. This is a food price index, and this is the media coverage index. And you see they're very highly correlated. It's about 85% correlation coefficient. What you also see, the second thing, is that compared to the media price spikes, actually the food price spikes don't look so bad, or quite small, okay? So basically the variation of the spikes in media attention are much bigger than the spikes in the food price index. And that's also what you see here, you see? So when it spikes, I mean, whoosh, that's the event effect from media coverage. Same thing, it spikes, goes higher, and then it goes higher. That's the outliers right here, okay? So that is the volatility effect, if you want. So it gets additional media. What you also see, there's this thing in media called fatigue, okay? The media kind of, if it comes up a couple of times, it gets boring in a way. And so that's probably why these spikes here are only half of the spikes of the first spike right there, okay? So there's very clear correlation of that. So then we did alternative words selection. We looked at different combination of words, and this is the correlation index. And you see, for almost all the combinations, there more than 80% correlation. So it's pretty robust to the particular type of word selection that we used. I already said this. Okay, then let's look at the development policy priorities to agriculture. Now, this is pretty difficult to measure, okay? So you can, I mean, you hear these things, you get an impression about, but how do you actually get some indicator about it? So what we did, we looked around at a number of different options, but it's hard to get something standardized that you actually can compare over time. And so I think the best indicator that we could find was the following. So every 6 months, the World Bank and the IMF have a joint development committee meeting. It's basically the ministers of finance or the ministers of development of all the countries which sit around, 25 ministers. And after the meeting, there is a summary, a communiqué, right, which summarizes the key points of the meeting. And basically, that is then brought out. Okay, it's a standard format, so it's roughly the same size, which is good because it standardizes the numbers. And so we did the same thing roughly as we did for the media analysis. Again, how much attention is being paid to agriculture or rural poverty, food security, etc. And this is the effect. So the correlation is again 85%. Okay, and so the correlation between the food price index and the attention to agriculture and food security. Now you may say, well, also with the media, food security, and that's kind of normal. I mean, it's not normal, remember? Because the food security problems were worse in 2004 and 2000, and right here if you want, okay, when the prices were low. And of course, it's not just food security. We looked at the attention to agriculture, etc. Okay, and so you got this paradoxical effect, where I'll come back to, that the attention to agricultural problems, etc., is higher now, actually when farmers are better off because their prices are higher. And this is again the same thing, so you have this shock effect, this volatility effect also on the agenda. So it's very stable here when the prices, again, this is the food prices, the red line, and this is the changes in attention indicators, if you want. So it's pretty stable here. There's a bit of attention, not much. You see prices go up, and then big spike in attention. Comes down again when the prices come down, and it goes up again when the prices go up again, and it starts coming down again. Okay, so again, these things right here. So it's very similar to the media effect, actually, what you see in the policy agenda. I just mentioned that. Okay, then the final point is on the policy actions. I mean, it's one thing to say we're going to do something about it, but then the next question is, are you actually doing something about it, right? And so the indicators we have here is really on where they're putting. We have also looked at actually decisions they try to make or emphasize in some of the policy reports, but I think the budgetary ones are better because it shows where the money is, right? And that's what you get there. So this is 3 different indicators. So the middle one is the one I already showed you earlier. This is the agriculture's percentage of development aid. The left picture is FAO. It means, so from all the money which is going to the United Nations, to the UN system, how much is going to the Food and Agriculture Organization? And you see that story is very similar to the agriculture's percentage of development aid. If you take away, let's say, these last lines, before the line here, it's a straight line down. And it's a big decline. It goes from almost 30% in 1985 to 15%, so half of that in 2007. And since then, there's a big rebound in terms of the money that goes to agriculture. The right column is about public investment in global agricultural research. You know that, I'm sure many of you know, the CGIAR system. I have taken from, we looked at a number of these centers, like IFPRI and ILRI, etc. I took this one because this is the most spectacular one, but you see the same effect in the other centers as well. This is from Summit in Mexico, and you see until 2007 it was pretty flat, and then there's just been an exponential growth in their budget, so it's a huge effect in there as well. We have also some numbers here from the World Bank, which shows roughly that in the 3 years before and 3 years afterwards, there was a doubling of the budget going to agriculture and related sectors. Okay, and then there was separate from that, they had this global food crisis response program. All right, so I'm coming to the end of my presentation. So, is there an urban bias paradox? So I said earlier, the traditional concept of urban bias is something that, since urban consumers are better organized politically, they can get government policies which is benefiting them and which is hurting farmers, by, for example, by keeping prices low, by taxing the farmers, etc. What we see here is a different type of urban bias, I think. It's actually the urban interest, the fact that food consumers were hurt, that is triggered through this mechanism which I described. So the interaction between better organization, this mass media effect, etc., then triggering global political action, that actually farmers are benefiting, hopefully, from this increased policy attention and increased expenditures on agricultural issues. And so this is a quote from our paper, from our conclusion, is that food price spikes have succeeded where others have failed in the past, to put the problems of poor and hungry farmers on the top of the policy agenda, and to induce development policies and donor strategies to help them. So, then, if the food price bubble burst, would it matter now from the political economy side? It depends. So in a way, I've answered the question, okay? I'm just summarizing. You would expect the opposite of what we just seen, okay? It depends, again, on the nature of the change. If it's going to be a gradual change, this is probably worse for the system than if it would be a spike, because if it would be a spike, that would basically trigger more media attention and more policy attention from the shock effect again, okay? It would probably, in terms of the structural change, it would reduce the lobby effectiveness and the policy focus, particularly lobby effectiveness, which would probably lead to a reduction in overall policy attention and a reduction in policy priorities and budgets. So, and this is my very last slide, are we in a unique moment in time? And I think we may be, and I'm just going to list these things, 4 elements which would suggest that we are actually, okay? So we have seen, based on what I just documented, we've seen a very strong increase in donor funding and policy attention to the problems of poor farmers and rural poverty and food insecurity in the world. At the same time, what we've seen, and Tom has shown some numbers on that, we've seen a dramatic increase in private sector investment in agriculture and an interest to invest also in the poorest countries. That's a second factor. The third factor is that a Kim Anderson study for the World Bank, okay, where he looked at these indicators of how government policies have evolved over time, show that the taxation of agriculture through government policies has reduced significantly in developing countries over the past 25 years. It's now much better for farmers, essentially, for agricultural interest than it was 10, 20 years ago. And the fourth factor is the significant growth still going on, certainly in Africa, etc. And so all these 4 factors would suggest that we are actually in a unique moment in time in terms of helping to eradicate, in particularly rural poverty and rural food security. Okay? And then, even if that's not true, we should not waste the perfect storm. Now it's here. Thank you very much.
Okay. I want to thank both Tom and Yo for a great set of comments, and we have about 45 minutes for a conversation and then a reception afterwards, so we'll have plenty of time to ask you lots of questions. And as the moderator, I'm going to take the prerogative to start the questions. And here at the center, we're lucky to have a lot of interaction with scientists as well as economists, and one of the questions that came up in my mind was on the volatility question. And Tom, you had mentioned climate change and its effects, but not so much about climate variability and its impacts. Over the weekend, Noah, you're going to enter this conversation now too. Noah shared one of his recent papers that deals with extreme climate events and the probability and increasing probability of extreme events. And when I think of, so maybe I'm going from bubbles to bubbly now, but when I think about some of these spikes that have occurred, if we think about Russia with its wheat, or the US has had some extreme variability in its climate, and with these large countries in the world market, when their crop production is really impacted by an extreme drought, flood, heat wave, whatever, it really can ripple through the world economy. And you talked about government intervention, but not so much about trade barriers and what happens when countries then put on trade barriers when you already have a spike. Does it amplify the spike? So I was wondering if the two of you could talk a little bit about, do you see the world being much more variable in terms of its prices in the future? How do you think about climate variability and extreme events? And Noah, you might want to say one or two words about your work on climate extremes, because I think it's really an important feature in this conversation. So,
certainly Tom can speak to. Tom can start by speaking to whatever he wants to say, but certainly our work for the U.S. on the climate extremes and
Right.
corn price volatility and the biofuels mandate.
okay.
Good. Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Start responding? Okay, great. Yeah, part of my sabbatical was working with Noah Diffenbaugh exactly on this issue, bridging. So thanks for setting me up, Ross. I appreciate it. It's very kind.
I want a question like that as well.
No, but it's an important question, and it's one that I skirted entirely, because I was talking about these long-run trends as if the world were smoothly flowing out into the future, and that's not the case at all. We see, as we saw, in fact, from these both commodity and media events that Jo outlined nicely. Recently, we've seen some real dramatic price spikes, and I think there are a number of aspects to that I think warrant discussion. One important one is the interplay with the biofuels. So during that period of run-up, when so much of the corn production in the U.S., in Europe, wheat, rapeseed, and so on, going to biofuels, combine that with some bad years, which always come along in agriculture, combine that with some policy responses, and it does become a bit of a perfect storm. In years when we should have been building up stocks or restoring stocks in agriculture, they were being run down because of the steady increase in biofuels. So we weren't building them up. We came into an environment of relatively tight stocks. On top of that, you throw in a few additional events into the pot, and you can get dramatic responses. On the policy side, trade in particular, there have been studies, Kim Anderson was mentioned here earlier, and Will Martin, examining how countries responded to these price spikes, and in many they responded in a way that exacerbated that, banning exports, adjusting import prices to avoid a burden on the domestic consumers and avoiding adjusting to this time of scarcity. So they've estimated for some commodities this may have exaggerated by another 30% this kind of price volatility. What Noah and I have looked at in particular is the interplay with biofuels policies. In the US, the particular problem is that we've been particularly unintelligent in the way we've implemented this biofuel policy. We've suggested there's a particular target. Come hell or high water, you have to use this much corn in ethanol production. And of course, in a year where, like 2012, when there's a drought and a heat wave, a production shortfall, you should be pulling back on the biofuels production in favor of other uses, and we weren't doing that. So the way this mandate is specified, it's going to become, as Noah and I identified in our work, virtually untenable in the future if you combine that with a future in which there are more frequent and extreme climate events. This is a very volatile combination, a set of rigid policies and in some cases counterproductive policies on the trade side with a world of increasing extreme events and volatility. 2012 becomes the new normal, if you will, and volatility could become a real problem. So I'm not meaning to paint just a rosy picture. We don't have to worry about this at all. In fact, that was a good point to bring up. Volatility is something that could be very important in the future.
So, volatility was one of your 4 points. And is the feedback loop that you were talking about with the media and government interaction likely to make it a more volatile world or a less volatile world?
That's a difficult question. What Tom just described, okay, the fact that that these governments and where Kim and Will Martin have done the study on the fact that these domestic government interventions to ban export or restrict export, etc., that has increased global spikes. Okay, it's obviously true. Okay, I think everybody who's looked at these things is true. The thing is that from a political economy perspective, it's a very normal thing for governments to do. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that doesn't mean it's the right thing from an economic perspective or a welfare perspective necessarily, but it's like, I remember when I was working in the 1990s in Eastern Europe with the reforms there, Bulgaria, for example, was a traditional grain exporting country, and with all the reforms there was problems, and of course it was very volatile, the harvest or whatever, and so whenever there was even the word was going out that they may not be even to not only not able to export, but not enough for their own population, basically the Minister of Agriculture was fired the next day. Okay, so they went through 7 ministers of agriculture in 2 years or something. And so it just did. The political incentives particularly in poor countries or for particular foods which are basic commodities for the country is so strong that it's very hard to go there. That of course doesn't mean it may be, for example, if China does that, it has repercussions, for example, if it's rice or something for Senegal, which is importing a lot of rice, etc. So, and that's for that reason, I mean, somehow we have to deal with that, I think, in the global trade negotiations or world.
Do you have confidence in the global trade negotiations in terms of smoothing things out?
I think, I mean, as I said, it's such a strong political incentive, okay, that maybe that was not, the last sentence was not the right word in terms of, maybe we need to look at alternatives of dealing with it instead of trade agreements. Can I just add one little thing? I was in India just a couple of months ago where there was a panel. And so I actually gave a similar version of this talk there, and there was other people, and so all the other people on the panel were talking about one thing, which was whether India didn't have too many stocks, or too much stocks in rice in particular. And so because they've been basically filling their stocks up because of everything which has happened over the 5 years, and so all the economists were arguing that they have way too much stocks right now. Okay, they should get rid of it, it was too costly and whatever. And then the government was implicitly saying, well, they think about survival, if they are running out of food, they're going to get out of business, and so they want to stay in the government. So it's a risk-averse strategy.
No.
So in this volatility theme, I was struck by the quotes that you showed, with the 2005 prices are too low, and this is hurting rural farmers, and then 2008 prices are too high, this is hurting the poor. And I'm thinking about the first paper that Tom and I worked on, where there was, we argued that the supply side volatility had a potentially greater impact on the urban poor than the rural poor, because the rural poor at least got an income increase when prices rose. And I'm wondering if there might, this contrast between the pre-bubble and the bubble, if there might be something real there, that there might actually, do we know if there was a shift in who those poor were, who those food insecure were in terms of rural versus urban? Yeah,
you can, it's a very good point, right? And actually I've dealt with it in the paper, The Right Price of Food, on this particular issue. The issue is rather the following, that if you have, let's say you have people living in the cities, right, next to the port where the grain comes in, okay, and they don't produce any food. Okay? That means they're very vulnerable for price variations, okay? Or you have another household living in the rural areas, very remote, And so price transmission is slow. It takes a long time for the rice to get there, or for the rice which they produce themselves to get out, right? So they're much more isolated, right? It's absolutely true that price changes are going to have very different effects on these two types of households, right? But the key point is, though, that when things go well, when prices, for example, go up for the producers, okay, that point is never made, okay? Or when prices go down, that people are actually benefiting a lot who are living next to the ports in the urban consumers, that point is never made, you see? So the point is, yes, it's true that there is very different effects for the two type of household, but it works both ways, because they can lose a lot when prices go up, okay, as consumer, but they also can gain a lot when prices go down because they live there. And the price effects are much more moderate, both on the upside as on the downside for the remote village. So it's symmetric.
Molly?
And that's, of course, not reflected in any of these quotes.
I'm struck by how much diets are changing. And I wondered if that entered enough into your conversations. We tend to think of the cereals, and they have shown quite different kinds of changes in consumption behavior than things like vegetable oils, as a good example. And so I'm wondering whether the changing composition of diets, and we often pick up livestock, but vegetable oils is one that I'm particularly interested in, and also because these expansions of vegetable oil demand has significant impacts on where it's grown, what it means for land use, and so on. So I think there's some other connections in there that I would like to have you develop if you could, and I think it starts with the changing composition of diets worldwide into some crops that we don't think so much about, like soybeans, like oil palm, for two good examples.
I'll start with that. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question, Wally. So in our simple analysis, we thought about three broad categories of food. And that is the direct consumption of the staples, the livestock, consuming, in a sense, crops through livestock, as you pointed out. But processed food is the most rapidly growing component of food demand in this analysis. I didn't emphasize that, but what I was showing were kind of the derived demand for crops through processed food. But in terms of consumption, that's the most rapidly growing in our projections, and that's because it has this high income response, and the vegetable oils would be in that package. But you're right, in breaking this out into a story that linked, in the case of vegetable oils, that increased demand for cooking oils in Asia with what's going on in Indonesia, oil palm industry, for example, would make it indeed much more interesting, but it would require making simple a little more complex. So I think other tools might be well suited, such as you guys have been pursuing here, might be better suited for that particular analysis. But it's very much in our mind that there are certain types of processed foods for which the consumption is likely to grow most rapidly, and we've aggregated those up to these categories in order to capture the broad character, and the broad changes in diets. So that is, we're true to your concern in terms of reflecting this changing composition, but we haven't gotten down to the level of detail that in the issue you're raising with vegetable oils. Do you want to say anything about that?
Any further comments? Yeah.
No.
Eric? I was going to ask you to say something about your recent work anyway in light of this comment, but you don't have to.
Yes, so Tom, you mentioned how climate change is going to be a drag long-term on future yields. Now, there's another trend that's purely social, is this demand by wealthy consumers for more sustainable food. And often that means less intensive, less chemicals, zero deforestation. Is this trend really an important player in that big picture that you outlined on the future of farm productivity, or is it a very marginal factor so far?
Well, I think until it's always a good discipline to actually try and put some numbers on this, to look at past trends or emerging trends, and to combine these into some framework like simple to see how it adds up. So there's no doubt that the signal from consumers that they care more about the environment, in a way you could view this as part of this future competition between environmental goods and calories from food. In a way, they're encouraging. They would be, if that signal is appropriately transmitted, I think they would be asking for food products that might be produced at lower yield in a more environmentally friendly way. So you would need, in some sense, more area to achieve that, and that creates its own kind of competition. But this idea that land in the future is going to be asked to deliver more and more environmental services, things we've ignored in the past, the carbon, but also other biodiversity. I don't know what the consumers particularly have in mind, but I think this is going to be more, this writ large, this category is going to be very important in the future. I can't say exactly which services are going to be effectively transmitted either from consumers or from governments to rural areas all around the world, reshaping the way they farm, reshaping the competition, the land available for agriculture, which lands and where. But I think it's something we need to think about more. So I'm glad you've raised that issue, but I can't really quantify it at this point.
So European economists, you have things to say on this. I know you've just written a chapter on it, actually. So.
It's a very good point, okay, and I think, I was actually intrigued when Tom presented it, because I think his slide is very, it basically brings it out very explicit, the conflict between them, or if you want a conflict, the trade-off, I guess is the right word. I'm just thinking in terms of, if we are, I've done a lot of value chain work in the past, of which, a lot of it is where you have rich consumers imposing demands on certain product characteristics or process characteristics, and how that translates to the production at the field level and the income effects. It seems to me that, it would depend a bit also, I think, on who is producing those products, okay? If it would be that, for example, these rich consumers are saying, okay, this is the type of product that we want, and then you compete at the production, for production inputs for land really with food that has to be produced for poor people, right? Then you have an obvious trade-off there, right? If it would be that some of these products are produced by poor people themselves, okay, then you're going to have to pay these poor people to do that. And that means you're going to have an income effect there, which to some extent will compensate for the fact that you have to pay for higher food prices, okay? And so the food security benefits would then grow through the income effect or the labor markets, if you want, and would, the prices of food would be higher, but they would have much more income to actually pay for that.
Can I follow up on that? Actually, we in the context of that Red Plus example, we've actually did a subsequent paper focusing exactly on this issue, the impact on different groups below the poverty line. And you see this kind of effect. Now, the thing that came through to us there, that the fact that in this case, these environmental services, you're bidding for land, and so the land prices go up, and that if you're in a rural area and you own land, you benefit from this policy because it's a land-focused policy, as opposed to maybe some of the things you're talking about, purchasing different types of food. But the interesting thing here, in the context of overlaying this with household survey data, where we actually looked at where are they getting their income from, how are they spending it, the upshot of the Red Plus policy was to really drive land prices up, and those rural households that owned land benefited from this. But the poor, you think about the poor, the fundamental characteristic is they don't own a lot. They've got their own land and labor, and that's about it, maybe a bit of land. And so they didn't benefit so much, even the rural poor didn't benefit so much from the higher land prices, and they were all affected by the higher food prices. So in this particular case, you're laying out this other dimension, the income dimension, worked out in such a way that, in general, that Red Plus policy is not poverty friendly, even with the big income transfers to the developing countries through that. But a different policy, maybe one of those that Eric has worked on, say in Morocco, or one of those you have in mind, it could work differently if the main impact was through labor in particular, and unskilled labor, increasing the demand for labor, because that's the kind of thing that will benefit the poor. But if you look at their income profile in these household surveys, and we've done it across maybe 24 countries, invariably in most countries, most of the imputed income is coming from their own labor somehow.
So I have been remiss in not having some introductions. So as people ask questions, please say your name and your affiliation so we all know who's talking.
My name is Bud Conrad. I'm a chief economist at Casey Research. Tom, I very much like your presentation in terms of the thoroughness of many things that you identified as drivers of price for the future. But as a kind of a layman watching things like World Watch Institute or Malthusian descriptions of the world that population is growing, there's no more land, therefore we're going to run out of food, I'm almost, I don't think surprised is strong enough, maybe shocked by your rather bland, look, it's been decreasing forever and it's going to continue to decrease commentary. And even though I think you justified it pretty well, I have to say I come from the other side of that, having read lots of the other literature. So I'm wondering if you could, I don't think the word is defend it, because I think you presented it pretty well, but more than the conclusions, the logic. Is it more importantly that the technology of increase of agricultural output has way exceeded the expectations of population growth, and therefore, don't worry, there's no problem, expect prices to fall? Or are there other things that you would say, you would point to in the list? But it seems to me those green bars below dominate the fears of the population growth above.
That's right.
Maybe you can go back and shift my sort of generic world fears of the future.
Sure. No, that's a great question. Thanks for getting me out of my bland academic shell, which, we're trained to be objective and look at this through the cool lens of an economic model in this case, and don't always respond to these strong feelings that are out there and strong opinions. So yeah, this has been, whenever I've presented it, a bit of a bombshell for a good part of the audience. And so I've thought about how best to handle that. And I think, first of all, the thing to remember, the things to really think about are the drivers. Okay, my analysis, how it's all put together in the end, is that distribution of possible price outcomes shows there's a lot of uncertainty there. And food prices could rise over the long run if technology growth slows enough. And it only has to slow to a rate which we have seen historically over certain decades. So it's up and down quite a bit. It's a hard thing to measure, first of all. Let me back up and a bit on the bland side for a moment, but a little of truth in advertising is, these productivity growth statistics are really the residual of reflecting what we don't know. You can measure the outputs, you can measure the inputs, and in some sense it's the difference between those two as it evolves that is this what I call total factor productivity growth, or the productivity growth. So it's something that we have a hard time measuring, but we can see its effect in some sense. In many parts of the world, flat input levels and yet in continuing increase in output. That's productivity growth. So the technology is critical, but think about it as a foot race. And you've got the demand on the one side and the supply on the other side, in particular the technological progress. It's a foot race that over the broad sweep of the last 5 decades, technology has won. So in a sense, by looking back to look forward, I think it's really those who argue that technology won't win in the future that should be, in some sense, on the defense of explaining why. Climate change is one argument. Slowdown in R&D is another. Now, the people who argue about the slowdown in research and development in agriculture are largely looking at the rich countries and public spending in the rich countries. But private sector is increasingly important there, and the developing countries are increasingly important. China, India, Brazil playing an important role. So I think they're often overlooking those other elements, focusing particularly on maybe their sugar daddy, USDA or others, and not looking at the broad picture globally. That's part of the story. But the population thing, that's why I put the incremental population growth in there. That figure I found very striking. The one where I showed these blue bars, where the decadal increments to population, shrinking, 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 even as population's increasing, the rate of population growth is slowing, and the absolute annual increments dropping by half from 2000 to 2050. So the number of people we're adding each year is absolutely less. And so in some sense, in this foot race, you just don't have to run as fast going out to 2050. So if we can keep up, even not as fast as we did, say, over this Green Revolution period, but if we can keep keep this supply side going to some degree, we should have a good bet at least stable prices. And I'm not saying they can't increase in the future. I'm saying, in that probabilistic sense, that Monte Carlo analysis, yeah, there's a place for World Bank and FAO and IFPRI, those who are saying prices are going to increase. But I'm saying, I think that for that analysis, they're relying somehow on a certain set of economic parameters, a certain set of projections that are required to get that. If you look over the whole range of possibilities, and we considered a wide range, we considered no biofuels growth and biofuels growth much faster than we're seeing right now in that distribution of possible outcomes. Population all the way from, the slow to the high. So, yeah, I'm not sure I've really addressed your question, but I think it's an excellent point. I mean, this is a slap in the face to a lot of people who have suggested that we're looking forward to, in dire circumstances. And I'm not saying that we should relax and kick back and let the green bar take over. I mean, I think that's clearly demonstrated to be a function of how much we spend in agriculture. And Yo's said that we're spending a lot more now. And provided that's spent in a reasonable way, that could have favorable effects. There's a lag of a decade or two in those impacts. And so if they can be sustained, I think we could be in good shape.
Thank you.
So Yo, will we continue to invest in R&D if the prices aren't going up very rapidly? I mean, you could also think, okay, the international community takes its foot off the pedal again and just...
Right. I was just thinking when the last point which Tom was making, that in a way, if you think it from the political economy mechanism which I described, okay, the best thing for Tom to be right is to shut up.
Yeah, I understand.
Because if the people who believe that the prices are going to be up and high and the thing is there, that will incentivize the policymakers to actually put money in it, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, he is more likely to be right in the long run, while he's now saying, well, it's going to go down the long run. Maybe the policymakers will relax, and therefore it's going to go up.
Yeah, it's somewhat ironic.
Yeah.
Hi, Carrie Armel from Precourt Energy Efficiency Center. So I have two questions. The first is for Tom. So it looked like your projections went out to about 2030. And I'm wondering if you looked at what happens after that. And also, when conveying messages to policymakers, I imagine you didn't go out past that because the models aren't as reliable, et cetera. And I wonder if the scenarios after that look a lot worse, sort of how do you compensate in your communications with policymakers so they're not sort of misled in their planning? Right. So that's one question. Then the second question is perhaps for everybody. I'm curious as to what the future scenarios of how China might play out could impact all of this. There seem to be some a lot of contention as to whether China's going to keep rising or whether it's going to collapse, and they have all these ghost cities, and they're planning on moving a couple 100 million people from rural agricultural areas into cities for industrialization. And it seems to me like both China's economy and their plans sort of on the agricultural and industrialization front could have heavy influences on how the world agricultural scene plays out.
You take China, I'll take the first one.
I wrote a book with Scott.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was looking for Scott back there. But you're free to talk now because he's not here. I'll address the first one. Thanks for asking that. Yeah, it's in some of the later analysis there, the water scarcity work, we were drawing on the projections only went to 2030, so we only went out there in that particular one. But all of the other price projections, the price projections all related to 2050. So I was looking a bit further, look back 45 years, look forward 45 years. We were kind of trying to be symmetric, and so that was the logic there. If this framework performed well, and I didn't talk about that, but it does perform remarkably well at the global level, we're able to predict backwards to 1961 more or less at global scale what happened over that period. We're able to capture this price change. So we thought with some confidence we could go forward up 45 years. And that's why we chose the 45 years. 2050 is also an interesting point because that's the point at which really the population growth seriously slows, depending on projections. Some have suggested that we would almost peak at that point, but I think the more recent projections suggest growth going out to 2100. But 2050 is kind of an interesting point, and so it wasn't accidental that I chose that. The population pressure is going to be strongest out to that point. After that point, climate impacts begin to be more important, so it could work in opposite directions. In separate work, we have gone out to 2100. Okay, and with a different kind of a framework better suited to very long-run analysis. In fact, we go out beyond that to a couple hundred years, but we only focus on that the next century. And in that analysis, I would say, I'm trying to think, what have we learned from that I omitted here that might be important in that context? And one point is that much more emphasis on climate impacts and also mitigation policies. In that work, we focused on the mitigation policies, the potential. A lot of the integrated assessment models that are used suggest mid-century and beyond a very large amount of these cellulosic biofuels being used to replace fossil fuels for liquid fuels and for bioenergy, bioelectricity. And that consumes a lot of land potentially. Hundreds of millions of hectares. And that can play a role even more dramatic than the one I was highlighting with red. So it's kind of an additional mechanism. You can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions by halting deforestation. You can also mitigate it by just planting a lot more switchgrass, miscanthus, other kinds of crops explicitly for biofuels, explicitly to replace petroleum. And some of these analyses of climate policy suggest that could be a very attractive part of the mix, and that would further create this pressure between environment and food in the future. So that's something to be thinking about. We've done some analysis of that. It's much more speculative, but I think that's something that may need more emphasis as you go out further into the future. But certainly in that long-run projection, population almost ceases to become a driver of demand as you go out because of these slowing growth rates.
I think the answer on China is simply yes. I mean, I think what's happening, if China would really witness a significant slowdown in economic growth, it's going to affect almost any scenario because of its size and what it affects. I'm just listing up three very quick points here. One is obviously the domestic. If domestic growth slows down, it means that income growth slows down, means food security. I mean, there's still 200-300 billion poor people in China, and so obviously that's going to affect their poverty situation, their food security situation directly. I think there will be also important effects. I think part of the recent growth in Africa is to some extent driven by demand from China, and so it will have an effect on incomes there, etc. So these are, if you want, two negative effects for global food security. But there's also, I mean, you have the opposite effect. If the demand in China falls, then basically it will make the food prices fall in the world as well, because it will reduce the demand for imports from Brazil and the domestic demand for staple foods and other foods, etc. So it could, I mean, this force is working in different directions. Okay.
Yeah, one of those directions, you might have read the recent reports of what percentage of their soils are now contaminated by different minerals, coming out of their industrial process, the water shortages and so forth. So there could be a resource constraint, soil and water resource constraint that leads to these effects too. Wally Falcon and I teach a course on the world food economy, and we have our students model the world food economy out to 2050, trying to answer this question, are prices going to go up or down? And how students, their assumptions on China always overwhelms their model results. So it's a great question. Other questions? I think, one more question, and then maybe we'll move to the reception and continue our conversation over a glass of wine.
Hi, my name is Lily Chong from the Carnegie Institution. So I see from the projections that we expect productivity to keep increasing, and we also see increasing investment in R&D. And I was wondering whether historically there is, you can make an actual connection between amount of dollars spent in research and percentage of productivity increase, and whether you think this trend will continue. Because I'm seeing two numbers. I assume they're correlated, but I would like an actual connection.
Great question.
I'll address that, and you can add if you like. So that's a great question. In fact, you're kind of laying out our research agenda in this particular area over the next 6 months. We're working closely with a fellow named Keith Fugly at USDA, who's built a database of R&D stocks and around the world. And so each year you invest more in R&D. In a sense, you build up the stock of R&D capital, and it depreciates over time. And he has done a survey of all of the studies around the world that have tried to link R&D stock with productivity growth. And so first of all, the first point is there is always a lag in that. You build up the R&D stock now, that will only have a measurable effect in a while. It takes decades sometimes for that to transpire. So the lag effect is very important. We need to factor that in. That's why I said what we're investing today is going to make a difference, 1-2 decades out. So there have been quite a few statistical studies that have addressed this question in varying ways at the country level, at the level of subnational level, at the international level, the links between R&D expenditures and productivity. And I think the magic number is 0.3. It's amazing how many of these studies have come up around that number, that a 10% increase in R&D stock generates a 3% productivity growth. And this is, but one of the interesting things, of course, these numbers are, vary, but it is remarkable. That's a figure that kind of jumps out at you. The other thing that surprised me, I was expecting this productivity to be higher in the developing countries, because there's so much opportunity to just grab other stuff. If you've got a scientist here who knows people in these other institutions, and you're at a very low level, can't you just grab those ideas and bring them to bear? You're not having to invent totally new stuff in order to have an impact. But Keith has been relatively convincingly arguing that because of the context in which a lot of these people work, poor infrastructure, a lot of the bright people, of course, come and go very quickly, not insufficient access to information that's out there. So much of this is, drawing on databases now that are available, that the productivity is actually, this elasticity is actually lower in a lot of the developing countries, which means you want to have an impact there, you've got to invest more, or somehow reform the research infrastructure so that it does become more productive. Anyway, we've been thinking about that. I'm just speculating, but I think it's a great question. It's the right one to be asking too, in this context.
Any other questions? So let's thank our visitors. And before I end, this is, I have to say, the first session I've chaired on food in at least a year where there hasn't been a GMO question. But we don't have to ask one now. We can ask them during the break because I'm not expecting one, but it's so funny. So anyway, you guys have asked great questions and great discussion, and we'll look forward to the reception. Thank you.